All right, everybody, let's get underway for Chapter 6, wrapping up our biomes. Today, we're going to talk about grasslands, desert, and tundra biomes, the biomes with not as much rain. Here is your essential question. I want you to describe two animals of the savanna and the adaptations that help them survive. Think about some of the most common. And let's jump right into it. Savannas, grasslands in the tropics. We talk about the tropics, 0 to 30, north and south. Then we talk about temperate, 30 to 50, 50, 60, somewhere in there. And then we talk about the Arctic, the truly cold, above 60. Savannas. These are plains that have full of grasses, as we can see. They have scattered trees here and there. Shrubs, they tend to be found in tropical environments and also the subtropics. Once again, tropics, 0 to 20. 20 to 30 is sort of the subtropics. We kind of rounded up to that 30, but just when you hear the terms. They're found mainly in dry climates, East Africa, Western India. Never been into Africa, but I've seen the grasslands of Western India, and they fit this category perfectly. They have a wet season and a dry season. Many of the animals are only active during the wet season. Kind of like in the temperate, how most animals are active in spring, summer, and in the wintertime, some of them hibernate, go dormant. They don't really hibernate, they're just not as active, kind of get hunkered down. And in these areas, because of the dry season, there tend to be lots of fires in the dry season, natural causes, what have you. This also helps to restore the nutrients back down into the ground. So looking at the chart here, once again, 0 to 30, this is where we find them by and large. They tend to be in that sort of 0 to 20 range and spilling over into the 30 in a few cases. So we find savannas, a specific type of grassland. We find some in Central America, South America. Africa is kind of the huge chunk, but large parts of India also fit this grassland. They have that classic wet, dry season because of the monsoons. And we also see them down in Australia a bit. Plants that we find in the savanna. Well, once again, since most of the rain falls during the wet season, tends to be monsoons, this rainy time, the plants have to be able to survive prolonged periods without water. Most of them then have horizontal root systems because when it does rain, the rain's there and they're designed to suck it up very quickly. These also help them grow quickly after a fire. Fire burns through, but the roots are out, the roots survive, and then the plants reshoot up from the roots. And lots of that grass in our yards, when you cut it, and it pops back up. The grass also have very coarse vertical leaves. We're taking a look at one here. The leaves grow straight up. We're familiar with that, but they're in the tropics. The tropics face the sun directly most of the time, so the sun comes straight overhead. Since they grow straight up and the sun's coming straight down, it protects them from the harshest bit of the sun. This is an adaptation that helps them survive. Now, trees that we find there, they almost always have thorns for protection. So you can see the giraffe here trying to eat the leaves. Well, it's got to get past all those thorns, and these thorny plants within the savanna give them a lot of protection from certain animals, other things that would otherwise just eat them completely. They have to be careful as they're eating around them. Now, what we find in the savanna are two largely different types of herbivores. We have grazing herbivores, like the elephant, and they have adapted to migratory. They kind of follow the grass. We also have browsing herbivores. And that was like the giraffe before, things that are eating the leaves off of the tree. Grazing is the grass, browsing are the leaves. Some do both, but this is just categorization. These are just categorizing the different animals. Now, predators will stalk these animals for food. So these migratory ways, it's all after food. The herbivores are following the nice grass, the carnivores are following the herbivores, and they turn around and come back, depending on how the rains are going. Now, because there's a wet and a dry season, The animals of the savanna tend to only give birth during the rainy season, tend to give birth early in the rainy season. That gives the animals, the little babies, time to have plentiful food out and about and get strong enough to withstand the dry season. We see the same types of thing in the temperate. Animals tend to give birth in the spring, so the little ones have a chance to grow through the late spring, summer, and fall, get big and strong enough to withstand the winters. Similar phenomenon, but they're giving birth during rainy season. And a lot of the herbivores that we find there reduce their competition by eating vegetation at different heights. Like we have the giraffe eating way up there, we have gazelles eating in one place, and other things eating on the ground. Once again, we have to find some ways to find a niche to reduce the competition so everybody's not trying to get the same thing. Tropical grasslands are savannas. Temperate grasslands, which is what we're going to talk about now, are grasslands, but specifically in this temperate, moderate climate. So they have communities that are dominated by grasses. Once again, few trees. They have hot summers, cold winters, and rainfall tends to be intermediate between a forest and a desert. Like in America, we have forest on the East Coast, gives way to grasslands, gives way to desert. Pretty common. The rains don't travel as far. A little less rain, we get our grasslands. They don't always have as much as a wet, dry season. It's just total amount of rain is not enough to support a forest. Can't support the large organisms. Temperate grasslands. They have the most fertile soil of any biome. Very few natural temperate grasslands, because of this, remain. We have replaced them with farms. This is where we grow our wheat, our barley, our corn, our rye, you name it, grows in the grasslands. And all throughout America and Europe and in India, we have largely gotten rid of the grasslands because the soil is so rich and fertile. These tend to be in the interiors of continents, as we're looking at the graph back behind us. Once again, in America, throughout Europe, this is where we tend to find them. And also in South America, down below the rainforest. Mountains are quite often crucial in maintaining the grasslands, as they are blocking rains coming from one direction or the other. Heavy precipitation is really rare in the grasslands. This allows the hot temperatures in the summer, once again, to make them very susceptible to fire. Their root systems, just like the plants in the savanna, grasses, similar thing, and they tend to form these really dense layers to survive the drought and the fire, which allows them to come back year after year. Grasses are unique that they grow from the top, so you cut them and they keep growing up. Most things sort of grow from the base, like a tree, but grasses don't. They grow from the top, so you cut it, it grows back up. You cut it all the way down, and it pops back up from the root system. Very few trees on the grassland. Lack of rainfall primarily, but also the fire and constant winds. A tree starts growing, it takes years for a tree to just get 2-3 feet tall. So 3-4 years, a fire comes by, burns off the leaf, the tree dies. Very few make it till they're big enough to withstand a small fire. From time to time it occurs. Once again, it's rare, and there's not enough rain for all of trees to grow. Animals of the temperate grassland. Now we get the grazers like the bison, the pronghorn antelope, and large flat teeth for grinding and chewing up this really coarse, thick grass. We also have, those are our large ones that are out and about, can defend themselves from size by and large. Then we have things like prairie dogs, owls, badgers, and a lot of these things dig underground. There's no trees to gut up into. There's nowhere to hide, so they burrow, go down underground, and this protects them from the predators out in the open, which might be coyotes, foxes, and once again, hawks, owls, things of this nature, which are trying to swoop and pick things off. So a lot of these animals, because there's no trees, etc., to go into, they have to rely on burrowing, going underground. Now, threats to our temperate grasslands. The main threat, you and me. It's turning it into farming, and if we over-farm it, that it can't grow as well, then it kind of becomes grazeland, and they've been over-grazed. We've just put too many animals out on the range, and it destroys them. The crops can't hold the soil in place when we farm. Part of the time we till it, it's open to the soil is open to the air rather, and then it rains and washes away, the wind blows it away. So erosion is a big problem. The grasses out there, they're constantly getting eaten, they're getting trampled, and then when we get too much erosion, the topsoil is gone, very hard to replace. Then this constant use changes very fruitful, really good soil into deserts. We don't have vegetation, we get erosion, don't have topsoil, plants can't grow, and the grasslands give way to desert. Not unusual at all. And that segues us nicely into the desert. We're going to talk about two types of desert overall. The chaparral and true desert. The chaparral is kind of scrub desert, but it is very specifically this Mediterranean style climate. The chaparral we almost always find near coastline. So all around the Mediterranean, as we can see here, we find the chaparral. We also find it down in the United States, the West Coast, southern region, also chaparral, Mediterranean style climate. It's a sort of a temperate woodland, if you will. The vegetation is going to have some broadleaf kind of shrubs. Tends to be very hot, dry summers. The winters tend to be mild and wet. Once again, not real cold, cool, and then damp. They're always in the middle latitudes, around the 30 north. So if we look down in South California, right around that 30th parallel line, also up around mainly in the Mediterranean region, which is this huge aspect. So as we take a look, once again, right at that 30 north, we have the Mediterranean, we have California. You drop down to 30 south, we see some in South America, South Africa, and the very tip of Australia. But these things always hover right at that 30th parallel. Kind of like where we are in Gainesville, but it's too humid for chaparral, much drier in these regions. So plants that we find in the chaparral tend to be low-lying green evergreen shrubs, like up in the picture here near that coastline, low-lying shrubs, not big trees, not enough rain. We also tend to get a lot of things like our herbs, sage, bay, rosemary, thyme. These are all types of plants that grow there. They have these little small leathery leaves, and these leaves contain lots of oils. Oils are what we're after when we go cooking. It has that really nice smell. We used to have a rosemary plant out here in Buchholz. Whenever we walk by it, kind of rub it. I love the smell of rosemary, but it's the oils that we get. These oils also promote burning, fires. Now, fires in the chaparral are actually work well for these low-lying plants, and they kill off the bigger possible trees because these heavily oiled low-lying shrubs pop back up from their root systems. And also a lot of these plants, any part of the plant that survives the fire, even if the top part, it'll replant and reroot. These are things that we do cuttings off of a lot of times to give some of your plant to someone else. Now, animals that we find in the chaparral, camouflage, shape, and coloring are kind of the big ones that we get to so that they can blend into the environment. Birds like quails. Now, when I grew up in South Carolina, we called them bob whites because their call is bob white. But quail, but they literally look like little rocks, if you will. Their shape is not as bird-like as we normally think, and they blend in. Their coloring and shape, they kind of look like the background. Lizards, chipmunk, mule deer, once again, most of these things have colorings that help them just blend right in. Threats to the chaparral, what's causing them harm? Once again, you and me. We want to live there, so we develop on them. And once again, humans have to have a place to live. I'm just pointing out this is the primary threat to it as an ecosystem. We want to develop on it. And a lot of times when we develop somewhere, then we want to put in what we're used to. Like I'm going to put in my nice grass backyard, even though that's not natural to a chaparral. There's been a lot of movement to have natural yards that are much more like the environment that you're in, and these can be really helpful and can help preserve and protect the chaparral, but that's the biggest one. We like to live there. You know, once again, the southern coast has mild winters, beautiful summers. Around these regions are places where humans want to be, and we tend to develop on them. That's the biggest problem. We go from chaparral, kind of scrub desert, into desert. Now, once again, the chaparral is very specific, like throughout a lot of America, Arizona, we still get some scrub deserts, some plants. And deserts range from having very little to no vegetation. They go for long periods without rain, and they have extreme temperatures. Now, deserts, we have hot deserts and we have cold deserts. Hot deserts like the Sahara, or cold deserts like the Gobi, but they're very dry. Very little vegetation, if any. You get enough, or you get enough lack of rainfall. You get no rainfall, you get no vegetation. And this is what characterizes our deserts, very little or none. They're often located near large mountain range. Like we see this picture up here of the Gobi Desert, right at a mountain range. Not unusual, because we get what we call a rain shadow. The storm comes in, it pushes up the mountain, it gets cold, cold, cold. It condenses in rain, condenses rain, condenses. By the time it gets up over the mountain, there's no moisture left in the clouds, and we have a desert on the backside of mountains very often. If we look at the map up here, it's a little hard to see because of yellow on yellow, but in America, you notice on the west, we have our high mountain range in the west, and then the rains from the east can't make it that far. Right along the coast of South America, down on the east coast of South America, the Sahara Desert, our biggest one, wiping all the way through Africa and into the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. Notice it's around the 30th parallel. In a later chapter, we'll get to why, but this is where cool, dry air is falling from the thermosphere. So it tends to be very dry air, and this is where we have a lot of our big deserts. And then once again, I talked about you look over into Asia, and up top, that Gobi Desert, very cold desert. And once again, large swaths of Australia, desert areas. Plants that we get here. The number one most common plant you find are the succulents. They're sucking the water up. My daughter loves succulents. I've never been a fan. These are cactus, if you will. And, you know, we think of our classic cactus, but they're all kinds of little succulents. But their leaves tend to be thick and waxy, and they conserve the water. This waxy coating helps keep water inside so it doesn't evaporate out as quickly. And a lot of them have very sharp spines. Some of these sharp spines are actually very specialized leaves. Other succulents have classic leaves. It depends. But the spines are also trying to protect them so things don't come in and eat them. Once again, we're in the desert, very little rain, so the roots spread outward, horizontally, not vertically. You get in deciduous forests, we get vertical, but in the desert, grasslands, very little water, roots tend to go very shallow, horizontally, just under the surface so they can grab as much water as possible. Obviously, plants in the desert have to be adapted to survive long periods without water. If the conditions are too dry, they die. But then they tend to drop their seeds, and the seeds will stay dormant until the next rain. And a lot of times what we see is the rains come and all of a sudden these plants pop up really quickly, they bloom really quickly in a matter of a couple of weeks. They grow, they bloom, they develop their seeds, ready to drop them for the next time that it can come. And some of these plants can actually absorb or be willing to lose up to 30% of their water as they go through these spells of dry and rainy. Animals of the desert. Now, animals in the desert tend to have very thick, scaly skin. Like we see this lizard back here, really thick, scaly, it looks like armored skin. Some of it can be for defense against the sun and other animals, and a lot of it is there to protect the water that's inside them so it doesn't get evaporated out again. Prevents water loss. That's the main thing behind this thick, tough skin. Now, we don't find many amphibians in the deserts, but we do find some. And the ones that are there, they have a pretty cool trick that they do, and it's called estivating. They estivate, kind of like hibernate. The animals that sleep through the winter, they estivate. They burrow down under the mud. So the rains come and there's rain and they're out in it. It begins to dry up and they burrow down in and they estivate and sleep through the dry season. Just like our bears will hibernate through the cold season, in the desert they estivate and they sleep through the dry season. Insects also, very much like lizards, strong, tough body armor to help retain water. And most animals out there are nocturnal. If you ever get stranded in the desert, some odd reason, plane crash, car goes off the road, and you're in the middle of nowhere, take a page from the animals of the desert. Don't go out during the day. Stay there, keep in the shade, hydrate yourself if you at all can, and make a break for it at night. If you know you're in with potential walking distance, or even if it's a couple of days, walk through the cool night, find somewhere to hole up, get in the shade, keep out of the sun during the day, or you'll have too much water loss. Move around at dusk till dawn when it's cooler. Speaking of cooler, that takes us to the tundra. Tundra is one of our coldest biomes that we have on the earth. Beyond tundra, it's just polar ice. The tundra is a treeless plain, like we see back here. Located in the Arctic or Antarctic, very low winter temperatures. It stays below freezing most of the year. Very, very short summer, if you will, just a season that's not freezing. Very short, very cool summers, and the vegetation is almost entirely grasses, lichens, and some perennial herbs. All very short growing, windy up there all the time, doesn't have a big growing season, not a lot of moisture. Once again, most of the moisture is in the form of melting snow. Snow that comes when it melts is there. Only the top few centimeters of the soil thaw out, and below that is what we call the permafrost. Pretty interesting feature of the tundra, where this entire area underneath stays permanently frozen. Permafrost. Top layer will thaw out only in the summer months. Now the tundra we talk about the Arctic, Antarctic. The Arctic, North Pole, we have a lot more land mass getting up in this Arctic circle. So upper part of Australia. Upper part of Alaska, all the way up through Canada, Greenland, and then up into the northern parts of Europe, and specifically Siberia through Russia. This is all tundra region. Down in the south, it's in Antarctica itself, which is a continent, and only the very outer edges of it during summer do we get some of the plant life. It's not really shown in this particular sketch, graphic illustrator, but we do get some tundra in the Antarctic. So the vegetation, what grows there? Freezing most of the year. What we tend to find are mosses and lichens. These will cover just actual rock surfaces. And we do find some of these little grasses and plants in the permafrost. Soil there is very thin. Once again, wide, shallow roots. Everywhere we have very little water, wide, shallow roots. And this helps anchor them against this really cold, icy wind, which is always blowing. The flowering plants there, the angiosperms, are very short. They got to stay out of the wind, otherwise they just get blown over, torn apart. And there are some very short woody plants, and they've developed these dwarf forms. I have this dwarf juniper that I have at my house. It only grows about this tall. It spreads out a little bit. It's a great kind of ground cover, but this is a classic woody. I mean, it's got like a stem I can break as opposed to just a weed or something that we find in the tundra. Everything is very short dwarf forms to deal with the cold, the wind, and very little rainfall. the animals there. Now, in fact, millions of migratory birds fly into the tundra to breed during the summer. It's very short, but they're migrating. They're following the food. And during the summer months, when it thaws, we become swampy. Bugs come out. Some of them have been like estivating. They come out, they're larviform, they hatch. Birds come in by the millions to feed on them. And as the summer goes, caribou, reindeer, move up and they're eating the nice new growth, which is what they like, and they find themselves up in the tundra eating all the nice little plants that they find there. And with the plant growth comes the herbivores following it, as the carnivores following them. So things like wolf, fox, bobcat, these are all they're migrating, but they're following the food. And then the herbivores in turn around when it starts to get too cold and follow what little food they have left back for the next season. We do have some year-round that stay there. Rodents, like these guys. Our lemurs, my favorite animal of the tundra. They're kind of these odd colored, they don't blend in, but they burrow underneath to withstand the really cold, freezing temperature things. So they stay active, they don't really go to sleep, but they burrow underground, huddle up together, etc. Arctic foxes and the Arctic hare, they're pretty cool in that they have two different coats of fur. In the summer, they tend to have a brown fur that's thinner, and then in the winter, they shed this thin fur and they grow an extra fur, which is very white to help them blend in. So they have this kind of camouflage thing going on. Once again, that's our year-round residents. The ones like our bobcat, they don't have a coloring change because they're only up there during the summer months. They're feeding on the deer and they're following the deer back. So we find them in the tundra, just not year-round. The tundra is also one of the most fragile biomes. So what are threats to the tundra? There didn't used to be many. The food chains up there are very simple. There's not as much life. So you disrupt any of those food chains and it becomes a serious problem. They've mainly been undisturbed by humans because it's so cold, there's not much of a time to be there, and there wasn't anything to get. We couldn't grow food, there weren't any resources, but we have found oil up in the tundra. So the threats come from you and me again. We go up to drill for oil and we do lots of disruption, like we're causing problems for it, there's pollution from it, and going for oil is cause of pollution, oil spills, oil leaks, any other toxic materials with it. And the area is so fragile, any damage to it can take hundreds of years for nature to take its course because it has such a short growing season. It takes a long time for any damage to be fixed. That takes care of it for our grasslands and our tundra, if you will. Take care, and we'll see you next time when we talk about Chapter 7, Aquatic Ecosystems.